John, thanks for coming in. I do appreciate it. Helen Bernard there doesn't want to see anything, I was going to say tax cuts, but we're not talking about tax cuts, we're talking about not introducing further tax rises, say, on national insurance. And she wants the state to be more targeting benefits. You, I guess, totally agree with that. And you probably, I suspect, are about to tell me that, what's the figure, the richest 1% pay, whatever it is, 30%.
It's around
30%
of all income tax, yeah.
So tell me why you are, without putting words in your mouth, tell me why you disagree with our last contributor.
Well, I think that, as you talked about, that there are lots of external pressures that the government can do nothing about, but there are many, many that they can do something about. And one of them is not putting up national insurance by 1.25%. Let's not forget that national insurance kicks in before the personal allowance for those on the lowest income. So this does hit those on the lowest incomes. If you're on £20,000 a year, I think your bill is going to be over 100 quid higher than it was the previous year. That's going to sting. So we are talking about something the government can do. What I'm quite sort of fed up with is this notion that if the government, needs money for a particular thing, be it an NHS backlog, that the only way to do that is with tax increases. Of course, it can save to spend by cutting spending elsewhere, reducing spending in other areas. For instance, they could look at areas like national pay bargaining, which is a centralised wage set for all public sector workers. They could look at things like cutting the overseas aid budget.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because on pay settlements for public sector workers, why should they bear the brunt when we are still paying out £14 billion a year to a series of regimes around the world from which we see no direct benefit? I know there are very strong arguments for soft power and all the rest of it, but there's such a massive disconnect on this one. If you go around the doorsteps, red wall seats, talk to people there and say, government wants to raise £12 billion from putting up your national insurance. That happens to be about the figure we give away in foreign aid budgets. I tell you what they'll say, and don't you?
Well, absolutely, and reducing overseas aid spending is a very popular policy, and this is a government that seems to like to do things by focus group and by polling. So, there's an open goal right there. But,
they won't do it, by the way, John.
Well, yeah, indeed so. But, as soon as there is an argument about we've got an NHS backlog, we need to put more money into social care, these are all true, and we probably do need to put more money into social care, but it's where we get that money from that's really starting to grate, because these are big decisions that the government are taking that are going to hit the poorest families quite hard.
On my peregrinations around the newsroom today, and I swear to goodness this was true, I came across a Ronald Reagan notepad, who knew, in our newsroom. That idea that you could have somebody whose entire raison d'etre politically was a low-tax economy, a monetarist through and through, I'd imagine it's a side of the argument you've got a lot of sympathy with. You haven't got many supporters, even in today's modern Conservative Party.
There are big pressures that are somewhat unnatural, the pandemic being one of them, of course, but we do need to return to normal quite soon, and there's quite a lot of external pressure to spend more and more money on all sorts of things. But if we're spending over £1 trillion, we ought to be able to reprioritise some areas of spending to those areas in which there is most need, like an NHS backlog. So I'd like to see more done on saving to spend, I suppose you'd like to call it. But there's also the idea of taking a longer-term view of the economy. We keep talking about if you increase a tax by a certain amount, then the Treasury will bring in a certain amount more revenue. Actually, if you take a longer-term view of the economy, if you have a low-tax economy, you can actually bring in more revenues in the long term through second, third round effects. It's called the dynamic effects of what happens in the real economy. So taking a longer-term view, if we are able to keep a lid on these constant calls for more and more tax increases, we might see in the longer term, actually, a much more dynamic economy, lots more growth, and therefore more tax receipts, more jobs, more people in work paying income tax and national insurance. So taking that slightly longer term view is helpful too.
John O'Connell from the Taxpayers Alliance. Really appreciate you coming in, John. Thanks a lot.